politics of fear and hate are wrong. We love you and politics of compassion
But America,
and love are right.
we are not going back.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Raise Red Living Blue podcast. Got a special guest today, Lee McInnis. How are you, Lee?
I'm doing good.
You are running for office. Tell us a little bit about the seat that you're running for.
I am running in Alabama's 3rd Congressional District. We start here in Lee County, where I live in Opelika. We run all the way up the Alabama state, Georgia state line, up to Cherokee County and up in Cherokee County. But then we also swing a little west. We pick up Clay County, Tallapoosa County, Talladega, Calhoun, and for the first time, Etowah County is now in this district for the first cycle. About 720,000 people, 500,000 of them live in rural areas outside of the big. The Census Bureau calls them urban areas, but I'm not really sure that, Talladega would be considered urban by anybody from outside of East Alabama. No disrespect to Talladega. We're a largely rural district that relies heavily on our farm economy. We do have some pockets of urbanization. The big cities are, of course, Auburn, Opelika, Oxford, Anniston, Talladega. I think you probably would throw Pell City in there, but that would kind of be on the bubble. And then Gadsden's the second biggest city in the district.
Oh, wow. God, that's a massive district. Well,
I don't complain because I met a guy that covers half of Montana for his district, so I'm not complaining anymore.
Yeah, that's a lot of drive time. Well, the district is, would you describe it as like ruby red?
Everything I've seen, and I don't know if these guys go out and do the research individually or else they, or they just hear one guy say it, so they are repeated. But everybody says this is a plus 23 Republican district. But I keep telling people that the way the Democratic Party has been performing over the last year, plus 23 means this district is pretty much in play. So I think it has been in the past. But then again, to be brutally honest, it's been a long time since we ran a candidate in this district who got engaged as early as we did, who has the background that I do, that is putting the effort into it and working to build. My background is in building operations, global cooperations within the Department of Defense. So building infrastructure to support an ongoing campaign is something I know how to do. So I think we've been doing that more than anybody else. And I think that, the 3rd district is going to be like a lot of districts in Congress this year, that people are going to be surprised that what they thought were ruby red districts aren't anymore, and are at best purple, or will even swing blue when the right candidate hits the polls.
Well, I want you to talk about like what you want people to know about Lee McInnis, what you stand for, what makes you the right candidate to take this thing all the way to, win in November to Washington, because, all the commercials, all the political ads we see, it's politics of fear. It's the demonization of any candidate that has a D next to their name. And, you just kind of scrape the surface of your qualifications there, but do a deep dive on that for us, and just let's educate everybody about what makes you such an, outstanding candidate, in my opinion, based on your experience.
Sure. Yeah. I was born in Birmingham. I grew up in Homewood. My parents were, I guess people have told me that it was unique, the environment I grew up in. My father had been an infantry company first sergeant in the Korean War. He was a first sergeant in one of the first racially integrated combat units in the U.S. Army. So he brought a lot of that experience back with him to Alabama in the 1950s to the 1960s. My mother was a Union member for 40 years. So we grew up in an environment where, people who worked, no matter what their race, religion, national origin, if they worked, they were due dignity and respect. We grew up in an environment where public service was expected of everybody who lived in a free society. And we also learned that if there's someone who can't support themselves, we have a duty to care for them. When I graduated from Homewood High School, went to Auburn University. Got out of Auburn University, I enlisted in the Army Intelligence Corps. Got out, went back to got a master's degree in communications and international relations. Then I went to work in the defense intelligence community, where I worked for the next 28 years. It's where I met my wife. We've been married 35 years. When we left federal service, we came back to my native Alabama. We settled in Opelika. I went back to Auburn, got a master's in history because I needed to, sort of channel my thinking away from, what you do in the intelligence community all the time. And I began to notice, starting in January of 2023, when, Mike Rogers first popped up on my radar trying to slug Matt Gaetz on the floor of the House of Representatives. I began to look, who is this guy and what is his, what is he about? And what I began to realize was that Mike Rogers was not providing service and not providing the advocacy, the representation that this district needs in Washington, D.C. We have issues in this district. There's no doubt about it. But he's not fixing any of them. In fact, in a lot of cases, he's actually making them worse. So I got involved with the Indivisible movement, the No Kings movement here in Lee County. I spoke at a couple of events, and more people began to ask me to run against Mike Rogers. Not just run, but specifically to run against Mike Rogers. And so I started again sort of digging into what Mike Rogers was about, how he was representing the district. And so in June of last year, coming up, it'll be 1 year next week, my wife Barb and I sat down and had a conversation about the possibility of running for Congress. I talked to some people I knew within the Lee County Democratic Party and the Alabama Democratic Party, reached out to some people up in Calhoun County, and just started exploring the possibility. And then last September, we formally announced that we were running for Congress. Because to me, it is a continuation of my service. I spent 30 years in the Army and in the intelligence community serving this nation. I don't see this as any different, anything other than an extension of that service. And so when people look at me, I want them to know, and when they think of me as a candidate, I want them to know that I am running to serve the 720,000 people that live in this district. I'm not running to serve, any my political party that I'm affiliated with. I'm not running to serve any single politician. I am running to serve the people of this district, which we have been sorely needing in this office for an extended period of time.
Oh my gosh. I've got a little bunny trail question for you. As you were talking there, I was like, man, I'm really curious to hear what Lee would have to say in terms of your opinion on the Pulte pick by President Trump to replace Gabbard as leader of the intelligence community.
Disturbing. What people don't realize, and when I talk to them about working in the intelligence community, was, specifically, I came up in the cryptologic community doing signals intelligence, and we literally had a library full of the regulations and laws that govern how we work. Because I am fully aware of the resources that are available to the intelligence community. I trust the intelligence community because I came up in the intelligence community, and I know the people who work there, and I know they're great Americans. I know they're patriotic. I know they're there to serve the nation. But we have seen in the past, specifically the biggest example, of course, is during the Nixon administration, where a politician, for his own personal ends, attempted to take that resources and turn them to their own personal uses. And when you're picking somebody for a job who clearly is unqualified for the job by any definition, the only seeming quality they have is a loyalty to an individual and a willingness to do anything to support that individual. That scares the hell out of me. I'm really proud that we have senators, we have legislators from both sides of the aisle that are beginning to stand up and say, this can't happen. We have to put a stop to this. This position is too important for our national security and for, even to a great extent, our national legitimacy. To have someone in this position whose only qualification seems to be, their unquestioned loyalty to an individual. So yeah, that's, when I heard it and I started looking into his background, I was just flabbergasted that anybody would have the nerve to actually try to make that appointment. It's absurd.
Gosh, couldn't agree more. And I want to kind of expand on what you were talking about in terms of your motives for running. And I hear this from many of our Democratic candidates across the state, all of which, make similar statements about having this strong desire to serve everybody, not based off of political party, political affiliation, ideology, any of those things. Because I think this is a fair statement. I want to get your take on it, that maybe it's not fair to say all, but I would say most of the elected representatives, all the way from like the state house to our Washington delegation, if they're Republican, they seem to view their constituents as Republicans and not Alabamians. What say you?
I've had some conversations with some people, that face-to-face conversations that were tense, with people that looked at me, and the first thing they said was, and I get this question a lot. I say, well, they look at me and they say, well, are you running as a Republican or a Democrat? Or are you a Democrat or a Republican? I say, well, I'm running as a Democrat. And they say, I'll never vote for a Democrat. And I ask them, well, why is that? And then what I begin to hear from them, when the ones that will actually answer me, is, I work in agriculture and I don't believe Democrats understand farmers. I pick any number of single issue voter issues. And we will begin to have a conversation. Because I don't agree with a lot of their positions doesn't delegitimize their position in a lot of cases. So people in this district will all benefit when we all benefit. I mean, that sounds, obvious on its face, but if Republicans benefit and they're economically more stable, the Democrats that are living next door to them will benefit from that. I don't see any point in trying to act like I'm only going to represent, roughly 35%, of the people that live in this district. I think that's just ridiculous. We're elected to represent all 720,000 people in this district. And when I say that a lot, my job is to represent all 720,000 people, all the communities, all people. And the fact that I know of Republicans that won't have Republican elected officials that screen who comes to their meetings because they don't want to have a Democrat in their meetings. When we get invited to somebody's home to meet some people, I just put on one requirement. I just say, yeah, you've got to invite Republicans. And they look at me like I've gone insane. And they're going, well, why would you want to just talk to Republicans? I said, because if we just talk to Democrats, we're going to lose this election. We have to convince, there are independents and there are swayable Republicans that we have to reach out to. So don't just invite Democrats. Yeah, and I see what and again, Mike Rogers hasn't held an open town hall meeting since 2017. We've already had 3. I talk to Republicans people get really upset with me because I actually engage with people on social media, because that's how we engage with people in 2026. I want to hear what everybody has to say, because I am going to be representing everybody.
I love it. Yes, I think it's so important for us to just try to kind of drill down on this and expose a little bit of, where this concept of never voting for a Democrat comes from, because that's what so many people say, oh, I could never vote for a Democrat. This particular example you mentioned was about agriculture. I don't know where this person would receive information or lived experience that would have them come to the conclusion that Democrats don't understand agriculture. I think the bigger issue that I see, again, is the demonization. So I don't think you served your country because you hate America. I don't think that was your motivation.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that and again, it's my background. It's who I am. It wasn't a deciding factor. It wasn't, I've had a lot of Democrats say, hey, I spent 30 years. We served 5 years overseas. I spent a total of 7 years serving outside the United States, including 1 tour in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. And I have a lot of Democrats say to me, let Mike Rogers try to call you anti-American. That was not a consideration of mine, was that he won't be able to make that argument. That's just who I am, and that's just my background. I went to Iraq and I went to Afghanistan twice because there was a need for my skill set. And it's not like Liam Neeson, in Taken. I don't have that kind of special skill set. I do really well in front of computers, and I'm a good manager of intelligence assets. But or at least I was. But there was that need. The nation had a need, and I had a skill set that would allow me to fill that need downrange. So we went. My wife even deployed to Afghanistan once. I mean, that's just the kind of family we have. But I don't. I've had people tell me that they thought Democrats were un-American, and I was going like, okay, fine. But what about me? Talk to me about my background. Let me tell you that I served, a total of 18 months in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let me tell you that I spent 28 years working for the Department of Defense. When we could run through the list of awards, which I really hate to do, but occasionally do, just so people understand that, I wasn't just sitting around collecting a salary. The thing about it is, though, I think the Democrats have been really slow. I'm unabashedly pro-America. I love this country, and I don't hesitate to tell people that. I think Americans think if you say you love America, we have given that argument over to the Republican Party. In the past, and I'm trying to push people to come out of it. People say, I don't want to fly an American flag because the Republicans own the American flag now. Well, then take it back. Go out there and fly your American flag. And when people ask about it, tell them, because you love this country as much as anybody else does. And your patriotism doesn't mean you have to agree with an individual. It means you are working every day to make this country better. That's where our patriotism and service comes from.
Love it.
Hey, fellow Blue Dots, we would love for you to connect with us on social media. We're on Instagram and TikTok at Raised Red Living Blue. Okay, back to the episode.
I love your campaign website. I love especially this big section here that really kind of outlines all of your personal positions on, the hot button issues. But in terms of the core issues of your campaign, is it, as your website states, economy, kind of leading the way, healthcare, this third one you have here in terms of we deserve better representation?
Yeah, what I hear, what we started hearing way back in June, it was right after Mike Rogers had voted twice for the Big Beautiful Bill Act, cutting $1 trillion out of Medicaid and Medicare. As we were traveling around and we were traveling up and down through these 11 counties, what I was hearing over and over again were people that were really scared about not being able to get to a doctor when they needed a doctor. I mean, one of the first people I talked to was a grandmother who, through circumstances, it happens, she had custody of her two grandchildren. And, and I just sort of offhandedly, and this was early on when I didn't realize how honest people were going to be. And that's the other thing that's really just blown me away, is how honest people are when you actually ask them a question and listen. I asked her what bothered her and, what keeps you up at night? And she says, I am terrified that one of my grandchildren is going to get sick at 2:00 in the morning, because the closest emergency room is almost an hour and a half away from here. And I'm going to have to drive to that with a sick child, and it's going to take me 90 minutes to get there. We've got too many counties in this district that don't have pediatricians. We've got too many counties in this district that don't have labor and delivery services. I talked to a lady who lives in up near the state line up in Cleveland County. She had an hour and 20 minute drive. She could have been in LaGrange in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But because she was using Medicaid, she couldn't cross the state line. She had to drive to Opelika to deliver her baby in labor. And it was over an hour drive. I mean, that's just unacceptable in the richest country in the world in 2026. And that's what I was hearing a lot of. And then as we began to explore the district more, we began to find towns like Gadsden and Lafayette and Camp Hill, where they don't have access to clean drinking water or a functioning sewer system, where their sewer systems are on the verge of collapse. These are not want-to-have items. These are have-to-have, or this town simply goes away. And we began to hear that over and over again. So we made healthcare one of our big functions. We started hearing from people that said, I working in the mills, in the few remaining mills we have, I haven't had a realistic pay raise in 30 years. I'm still making $10.25 an hour, and I've been working for those guys for, 25 years. And then you begin to see things like, the Society for Human Resource Management says nearly half of the people in this nation aren't earning a living wage anymore. And that is just going to continue to be a knock-on effect. And we need to make sure that people who work earn a living wage. We need to make sure that small businesses have the same chance of succeeding and get the same economic breaks that big businesses do. I ran into a small business owner up in Roanoke. She was talking to me about business owners, and I suddenly realized what she was saying was that she was a business owner just like Jeff Bezos is a business owner. And I was like, ma'am, you need to understand, you want a small business that employs 10 people. You are not Amazon.com. And we need to build an environment where those people, because those are where most of the jobs are generated in this country. So we need to make sure that the economy works for the people who work in it. Having grown up in a union family, yeah, I'm very pro-union and want all our workers to have the right to collectively bargain. And then when it comes to accountability, I just hear so many people over and over again say, well, you're just running. I mean, people have looked at me and say, you're just running to get rich. You're just running so that you can, pad your bank account. I'm like going, I've had a good career. I do not need the money. I will tell you this. I had promised my wife that, After all the traveling and everything I'd been through in my career, it was going to be time to settle down. But then when we saw what was going on in this district, we had to run. So we're going to do things like term limits, 12 years in both houses. Then you have to get another job. Members of the Congress can't trade in individual stocks. They can't take a lobbying job for 5 years after they leave the House of leave Congress. And then we're going to impose a judicial code of conduct that's going to apply to the Supreme Court. We're going to do all of this because we need to make sure we put in place representatives of the people back at home that actually are listening and understand what the problems they're facing are. Yeah, I get every day. I have somebody come up to me, or nearly every day, a couple of times a week, people come up to me and say, "Hey, listen, is Russell Medical Center in Alex City going to close? Is the Tanner Health Center in Wedowee going to close?" And I'm going like, nobody can promise you answer that question one way or the other. And people are beginning to really get scared about all of this, that they've lost control. So one of the things that we're working for is to give them a sense that we're listening to them and their problems.
Mm. Yeah, I know things are starting to turn. The tide is starting to turn. People are starting to wake up. It's frustrating to me that it's such a slow burn and such a slow evolution. I saw a graphic the other day that showed all the states across the nation that Trump still had a favorable rating in, and like Mississippi he doesn't, and Alabama he does. And I'm just like, when did Mississippi start kicking our butt? I mean, they're kicking our butt in a lot of categories. That should be a wake-up call to everybody in our state.
When I saw that Donald Trump was underwater in Mississippi, I'm going like, okay, there is an opportunity here. And then when I saw they flipped Tarrant County, Texas by 31 points, you begin to realize that there is an opportunity here. And then when you've got guys like James Tallarico that are running, that are that are presenting a whole new voice for the Democratic Party, that are moving the Democratic Party in ways that I really was able to embrace. It's going to be a completely, November 4th is going to be this year is going to be a completely different day than November 3rd was. Once the election results come in, I think there's going to be a lot of changes in this country.
God, I hope you're right. Well, have you always identified with the Democratic Party, or has that been an evolution for you?
To be honest with you, I will tell you that because of that weird upbringing I had, where my father was very progressive on race for a blue collar guy in Alabama in the 1960s and the 1970s, that made him very unusual. My mother's family was all a bunch of coal miners and steel workers, so we've always been very pro-union. But, like a whole lot of people, especially people like me that were involved in national security and national defense, there was always an attraction with the Republican Party. I used to say I was a Reagan Democrat for a long time. Then I started just saying that I identified as a Republican for a long time. But I think the change came when I came back from Baghdad in May of 2005. And when I really began to realize that what you were hearing out of Washington, D.C. had nothing to do with what was happening on the ground in Iraq. Nobody was. I don't think they were actively giving the American people bad information. I think what they were doing was they were portraying something they thought to be true, they felt to be true, but wasn't actually true. And then I began to look at those things about, they don't want, then I began to realize that a large part of the Republican Party did not want you to explore the facts. They wanted you to explore your feelings. You feel something should be true, and we're going to act on that, especially when it acts to our benefit. And so I began drilling down, I began questioning, and then, they did some really, the Republican Party did some really outrageous things. We were in Tampa at the time, and they nominated Rick Scott, who was an unindicted co-conspirator and a massive Medicaid fraud. And once they nominated him for governor, I said, I'm cutting ties with the Republican Party. And that was back in 2006. So I was an independent for a long while, but I was still covered under the Hatch Act as a federal employee, so I couldn't participate. But then when I left federal service, and Barb still had a couple of years, and her job moved up to Augusta, Georgia, I was able to volunteer and help out on the Stacey Abrams campaign, on Reverend Warnock's campaign. And really, that's when I began to say, and tell people that I was a Democrat. Now, do I agree with absolutely everything the Democratic Party stands for? No, that's why I generally say I'm running as a Democrat, not I am a Democrat. Yeah, it's a small change of words, but I want people to know that I agree with most of the premises that the Democrats run on, and I could work with almost any Democrat, but I still have that independence where, I told somebody else that, they said, you couldn't work with Republicans though. And I said, hey, Lauren Boebert tried to get a resolution at the floor of the House trying to end the war with Iran. If Lauren Boebert, who I disagree with on literally everything, came to me and said, will you co-sponsor this? I would co-sponsor it with her, because this was in the first couple of days, I said, this war with Iran is going to be a disaster, period, close quotes, into sentence. And I would work with her on that. So that political divide, I just, I look back to guys, like John Lewis, Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the Senate. I mean, these were people that could work across the aisles and make deals. And if a plan helps the people of Alabama's 3rd Congressional District, it'll get my support. If it doesn't, it won't. I don't, no matter what party it comes from.
Yeah, I just, as you're talking, it occurs to me, it just seems very obvious that this is the kind of mindset and the kind of background and, again, lived experience that somebody really, I think, needs to be an adult, a mature representative. Your third key issue on Alabama needing better representation. I mean, you've already been critical a number of times of the Democratic Party in this podcast. It's just the blind loyalty of the Republican Party and the blind loyalty to Donald Trump, and the fact that they're very open and transparent about their constituents. If they're not Republican, they don't really see them as constituents. And then Washington has become a place where it is like career suicide to work across the aisle. And it's just gotten so dysfunctional. So, it bothers me when I see people, attacking folks, using the term rhino to describe them. I mean, who cares? It's all about what's in here and what's in here, right?
Yeah, I had somebody the other day tell me that Mike Rogers was a rhino, and I'm like going, what does that even mean now then? I mean, he has literally supported Donald Trump on literally everything he said. And that's one of the big challenges in this race, is that we made a decision early on. We were going to run against Donald Trump. We were going to run against Mike Rogers. But when you try to define the difference between Donald Trump and Mike Rogers, it becomes very difficult because he is so loyal to the president. But I mean, and I asked, why do you call him a rhino? And he's going like, he just is. And then he just goes on. I mean, and what it boils down to is, I think that's the same thing where, I've already been called on multiple occasions a communist, a socialist. And I was going like, well, what about me? What have I advocated that you think is communist? And they're going like, I just don't like what you're saying. Okay, then that's not necessary. We disagree on policy. That doesn't make me a communist. But I think people have gotten so used to, especially on the Republican side, so used to those culture issues that those words have undue impact. I mean, it's like, you look at the Alabama legislature this time. I mean, what were they the most excited about and the quickest to move on? Renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and making sure we don't get Sharia law in Alabama. I mean, how is that going to help our school systems? How is that going to keep rural hospitals from closing? And Tommy Tuberville is leading the charge in that. And I'm not running against Tommy Tuberville either. But I mean, people are desperate, I think, to hear people talking about, this is what's going to help you. This is how we're going to improve your life. I had somebody jump up the other day and say, well, how are you going to get more jobs in this district? And I'm going like, we don't need more jobs in this district. We need a living wage in this district. That's what we're focusing on building an environment where our wages can increase so people can actually afford to live. And so we're trying to have the conversation where we avoid, those gotcha questions, the verbal traps that people throw out for you. To where we actually can engage people in a conversation. I don't turn when anybody approaches me and asks me a question, I don't turn any of them away. I mean, I've got a rule on my Facebook page that says if you use excessive profanity, and again, I get to judge excessive. If you actually threaten anybody, you're going to get blocked and you're going to get your comments deleted. But in general, I enjoy engaging with people. And I think a lot of, especially Republicans, are kind of shocked that, when they come at me with their gotcha questions, I've got a detailed response ready for, because all of this is, I don't have to think about what my position is. This is just who I am. and what I think. And if people like that, I'll get elected to Congress. And if people, the majority of people in this district don't agree with that, or find they can't overcome their red-blue divide, I won't. But hopefully, I think we're going to make that change, and I think we're going to get people to listen.
Love it.
Hey, fellow Blue Dots, don't forget you can find all of our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Please hit that subscribe button, and we would love a review. Okay, now back to the episode.
All right, so we're deep into the second half of the episode, and I wanted to I really want to touch on every one of these bullet points on your positions. You've got this big section of Lee McInnis for Alabama.com.
Yeah, and I grew up
misleading information about your positions, right?
Yeah, because there were a couple of people that came in and they put out this summary, and a couple of people on social media said, yeah, vote for him because he's a Democrat, but really there's nothing here that says that he supports the things he should be. And I said, okay, so I reached out to those people and I said, so what do you don't think I do not support? Because I can't cover everything all at once, and they gave me a list. And so we put together that list of things so that people would, it's very surface level, but we wanted to make sure that people understood exactly where we were coming from on a whole host of issues.
Well, the first one is the Constitution, and I see the Democratic candidates being far better representatives and proponents of the Constitution as the Republican Party in our current political climate. But talk to us about your position on the Constitution, especially issues we're dealing with right now with the First and Second Amendment.
Yeah, I will tell you that it was really funny the first time, we everybody that's running for Congress, especially Amanda Puszczek up in the 4th District, Clyde Jones and I have gotten to know each other really well. He's down at, I don't know what district he's running in today because the Republicans will change it before the end of the week.
Mm-hmm.
But Clyde Jones, we've got a lot of, our backgrounds are in common. Keith Pilkington, a bunch of us have run. And it was sort of surprising to me, pleasantly surprising, that suddenly we're talking about Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and the duties and responsibilities of Congress. And the fact that everything that you see going hideously wrong, tariffs, the war with Iran, mobilization of the National Guard for law enforcement issues, all of that is listed in Article 1, Section 8 as a role of the United States Congress. There's a reason the Founding Fathers put those things in there. What I don't think they ever envisioned would happen was that people would work very hard to get into Congress and then throw all their power over to an individual. I think it was Jamie Raskin the other day when somebody was coming into his committee, the Judiciary Committee, talking about, we have to stop Sharia law. And he said, well, why don't we stop all of this, stop all, religious laws? And then he read them the First Amendment. And it was just, the core of the First Amendment is the ability to speak so that we can hold people accountable, the ability and the right to worship our God as we see fit or not to. All of that is just so basic to America. And I know that when they talk about putting the 10 Commandments in school, they're just doing it because they don't want to talk about what's really going on in their districts. They don't want to talk about, the lack of health care in rural areas. But okay, so that's the first. Second Amendment.
Yeah. Do you own guns? I think that's what everybody wants to know.
I do. I own guns. I own several guns. I own antique guns. I own some fairly modern guns. I professionally, as part of I qualified with an M16 for the first time at 17 years old. I carried and was trained by federal law enforcement multiple times during my career, because as part of my job, carrying firearms was part and parcel of it. I carried an M4, which is the exact same thing as an AR-15 in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I own guns. I understand guns, but I also understand that there is no need for a civilian in the United States to own an AR-15. There's no reason for anyone, a civilian in the United States, to have a 30-round magazine. That's not what those items were not produced for those purposes. Those are meant for the use of military forces. I also know that in the state of Alabama, you can be committed to a mental institution because you're a threat to yourself and to your community, but you can keep a large cache of weapons at your house. And when you are released, you immediately have access to that. That makes literally no sense to me. That is putting people in danger. So I absolutely believe in the right to own guns. I just think that we have to have some common sense parameters by which people can feel safer in their daily lives than we currently have.
as opposed to doing nothing, right?
as opposed to doing nothing. I had somebody the other day was yelling at me about trans athletes. And I just asked him a question. He said, well, I said, how many trans athletes do you think there are in Alabama right now? And he said, well, one's too many. And somebody in the crowd yelled, too bad you don't feel that way about school shootings, which was kind of pointed. But I think that's certainly, at what point do we say we need to have a conversation about guns? Now, there are people now that will listen to this podcast who just decided not to vote for me because I've said I wanted to have a conversation about guns.
Yeah.
And I understand that, but we have to, you can't cater to every interest group. And that's having common sense gun laws just is supported by most Americans. It's the way ahead, and we have to do something.
Love it. All right, let's move on to healthcare and talk about healthcare as human right.
So we served in the United Kingdom for 5 years, where there was a national health system. We worked with Canadians, we worked with Australians and New Zealanders who all have a nationalized health system.
Who the Republicans, excuse me for interrupting, but who Republicans would say is absolutely a horrible system. So did you ever need to go to the doctor when you lived in the UK? And what was your experience?
Oh, yeah, we spent 5 years working under the national health system. Yes. And we found overall it was incredibly good care. It was not a horrible system. It was not breaking down. The policy I would advocate, first of all, I would, support whatever we can do to improve the system we have now. But in the UK, you had sort of a dual system running where that you had basic health care provided by the national health system, but then you also had the option of buying private health insurance, which would, if you had the ability to do that. But basic health care was provided by the government. And you work through your local, what they call their local surgeries, the local offices. And again, we overall had outstanding coverage through the NHS. Well, I mean, we have great health care back here, but how many times a week am I on the phone with Blue Cross Blue Shield trying to sort out what's going on? But in the richest country in the world, in 2026, we should not have Congress threatening to take the health insurance of 50% over half the children in the state of Alabama. I mean, they have said point blank that if they win the House again in 2026, they're going to look at ending Medicare or Medicaid. The childhood health insurance program, CHIP, comes through that. I mean, the fact that we're even having that conversation is just crazy to me. But people have gotten so entrenched on every social program we have has got to be questioned, you have to do away with it, while at the same time, we're doing everything we can to maximize the profit for multinational corporations. That to me is just insane. I believe that everyone in this country, in the richest country in the world in 2026, has a right and can have access to basic health care. So, and I don't think it's that hard.
Well, I just mentioned, I think I saw this in my news feed that Mexico is either actively passing laws, is moving towards, or is already there, moving towards some sort of a universal healthcare program. And I think most Americans would view Mexico as a less sophisticated nation, to put it politely. Yeah. But I did a podcast last week with Candace Duviel out of North Alabama running for Senate. Yeah. And we were talking about how GoFundMe is not a strategy. A good friend of mine in Memphis, his wife was diagnosed with leukemia. He's a real estate agent like I am. They're lower middle class folks. They had to start a GoFundMe page right away. I mean, this can't be a strategy for Americans moving forward.
We as Americans pay more per capita for health care than any other developing nation in the world, and we get the worst outcomes. At some point, and part of the problem is that because we have made healthcare a for-profit industry, and there are people like the health insurance companies that can throw massive amounts of money at lobbying, a massive amount of money into campaigns. And one of the reasons why I have sworn that I will not accept any corporate PAC money is because I will not. It's a way to prove I will not be beholden to those corporate interests. I will be beholden to the people of this district. And that's it. So, yeah, there's no, I think even Republicans are beginning to admit there's no reason we can't. We just don't, and everybody, and what the Republicans like to say is, well, Obamacare was a train wreck. Well, Obamacare wasn't what the Democrats wanted. Obamacare was what the Republicans would agree to. So there's all sorts of options like that. Mean tested national insurance. I mean, there's any number of solutions that are available. that would be better than what we have. It's just that there are so many people that are entrenched in saying socialized medicine is going to lead. Yeah, I mean, I even had somebody bring up the other day death panels from way back in the Obama administration. And it just, when now we're talking about, we've 130,000 people in the state of Alabama have lost their health insurance since the beginning of the year in the last 6 months because of the ACA tax credits, because the Republicans keep the House and the Senate. It's going to be far worse. So, yeah, that's something we're fighting for, and that's something we talk about a lot. And in the rural areas, it's going to be way worse because you're not going to have health care in your county at all. I mean, we've already got one county now that does, in this district, that doesn't have a full-time medical professional. They've got an urgent care that's open, business hours, and that's their medical care in that county. We have to be aware that things could be better than this.
And we just don't want, I mean, it just seems like people that are really dug in on the Republican side, their mindsets don't shift until maybe it's too late, until a crisis comes to their doorstep and they're like, oh crap, I don't have health insurance, or we don't have ambulance service, or the nearest hospital is an hour and a half, 2 hours away. Then they go, why am I having to deal with this? Then they start asking the real questions.
Yeah, I was talking to an EMS chief in one of the counties, and he told me that because Opelika, East Alabama Medical Center, is the closest trauma center they have. If you dial 911 in large parts of his county, it's 2 hours from the time you make that phone call, the ambulance gets you, and you get to that trauma center in Opelika. It's 2 hours. I mean, if you're having a heart attack, that's not going to work. But one of the things I want to make a real quick point about is, we will call out Republicans and we will call out the Republican Party because we feel, they need to be held accountable. But we do not, in this campaign, we do not call out or demonize Republican voters. I had a good friend of mine put it, all 720,000 people in this district I think of as my neighbors. And when your neighbor gets conned and they get all their life savings stolen, you don't go over and laugh at them and tell them they had it coming. You go over and say, I'm sorry this happened. How can I help? And that's the way we try to approach it. So, again, I will call out Mike Rogers. I try not to call out Donald Trump because, Donald Trump doesn't live in this district, but we will call out them for their actions, but we will not, we try not to call out, Republican voters. They were just conned out of their own critical thinking abilities.
That's it.
So we, in his one, he, that good friend of mine told me, he said, when I was asked in a public meeting, what do you say to a Trump voter? And this individual said, you know what I say to him? Hey, welcome home. We've got work to do. That's the approach we take. And that's why I always talk about the whole 720,000 people in this district, not one political party.
Well, I think the next one on the list, economic justice, will really be a hot button talking point for folks because, I think everybody would struggle to, maybe they're not just going to totally agree with you, but they'd have a trouble debating you on a lot of these issues. But I think like raising the minimum wage, who would not want to get behind that? And that's not something that you hear Republicans talking a lot about.
Sadly enough, there's a lot of people that won't want to get behind it, apparently, because, you saw the story on AL.com that the 4 Starbucks unionized in the state about a week and a half ago. People were furious. And again, this is how they've been talked to for so long. Individual looked at me and said, well, if you raise the minimum wage, businesses are going to go out of business and we're all going to have to spend more money. We're all going to go bankrupt. And I went, okay, sir, let me ask you a question. Do you work for a government organization? And he said, no. And I said, so you work for a private company, right? And he says, yeah. And I said, you either sell a product or you sell a service in order to make a profit. And he's going like, yeah. And I said, you realize the model you just built means you'll never get another pay raise. He was going like, what do you mean? Your pay raise would be just the increase in personnel costs, just like raising the minimum wage. Do you understand that? And he looked at me really funny, like, no, that doesn't make sense to me. And I had, I just said, salaries are personnel costs, and that's part of the cost of running a business. So when you say we can't raise minimum wage because it'll cost too much, that means we can't raise any salaries in private industry. And he just looked at me for a second and he just stared and did not understand what and he was, you could see he was trying to noodle through it and figure out what it was I was saying. I mean, there's been 17 states that have raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. There's places like Seattle where, workers are working fewer hours, but they're making more money. Their take-home pay has gone way up. More people are coming off benefits. More people are paying taxes. Raising the minimum wage, the Congressional Budget Office in 2019 said we could raise it to $12 an hour and it would overall be beneficial to the economy. And that was 7 years ago. My master's degree was in history, was in Alabama post-Reconstruction. One of the guys I read a lot about was Big Jim Folsom. I mean, he came in and saw exactly how the poor were being manipulated by the big mules and by the Bourbons to accept a lower pay because they thought they'd have, and I learned a lot from that is we have to talk to people about real economics and not just about, instead of trying to fight them. Sometimes we have to explain to them what exactly it is you just said and think about it for a minute. And when they do, we start winning people over to where thinking that, maybe I could vote another way for the first time in 30 years.
I'm wondering if we had one to really focus on, would it be climate change? Because one thing that I try to talk to people about to find common ground is whether you believe in climate change or not, that the earth is warming, you got to understand that our air and a lot of because this is maybe a way we could touch on a lot of different issues, because I think there's an environmental component to AI. There's a definite healthcare component to the air quality, the pollution.
Oh, absolutely.
So we all, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we all breathe the same air, yet well, not every, a majority of Republican voters seem just to be okay with rolling back all these EPA protections that keep our water and air clean.
Yeah, I a while back I posted a picture, when I was first started at Auburn, I remember where you would Top Oak Mountain and you could see Shades Mountain out in the distance and then Red Mountain and then the Jones Valley where Birmingham is, and you could just see that brown bubble that would just, always hanging over Jones Valley. When I was growing up, when I was a little kid, from Pinson all the way down to Dolomite, the Jones Valley was completely, people were burning coal, purifying coal to make coke. And I remember the traffic light, the street lights in Inslee coming on at 3:00 in the afternoon because that yellow smoke was just so thick, it was blocking out the daylight. So I to me, environmental protections are very personal, but and it took a lot to get those in place and to see them begin to back away on that. And now what we're seeing is municipalities, districts, states are willing to sell their soul to get the next data center because somebody's, and data centers are going to have a huge environmental justice issue with it because you notice they're not putting those data centers up in Madison or down in Mountain Brook. They're going out in Bessemer where they suddenly agree to build this data center and then they realize that the city of Bessemer, if they give the data center all the water they need, there's not going to be any water for the residents of Bessemer. I mean, and there's the heat that's produced and some of the gases that are produced. I mean, we have to make environmental justice a part of the conversation for everybody. But that being said, it needs to be a conversation. We need to have a give and take and a back and forth on it so that we can come up to an equitable solution that not only doesn't leave the United States further behind economically than the rest of the world is going to be as we move further into the 20th century, but still respects and shows dignity to the people that live in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. And that's just something we need to make it part and parcel. I'm all for business, but business has to be weighed against individual needs. When you talk about climate change, there was a time when we could have been the world's leader in climate change technologies, and we could have made a lot of money off of it and hired a lot of people, but we walked away from it simply because certain people in charge didn't want to acknowledge or thought they were going to make political hay out of denying the climate change. They ignored the fact that we could have been an economic powerhouse in that area simply because they wanted to score some political points.
Right.
And that's something we really need to be aware of and need to stay away from and be critical of.
Well, I think, as we close this out, I think it's just really important to just kind of hammer home. We have a lot of these issues that we're talking about are getting to be so critical to our survival, our livelihoods. I mean, if things don't change, and I know there was so much reporting on, a surge in Democratic voter turnout. I still, when I look at these numbers, I'm like, people, y'all got to get off the couch. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. you've got to exercise your right to vote. This is one of the most consequential elections in our history, I feel like, and we've got to make some changes because, you look at the deficit, the air we breathe, healthcare, minimum wage, all these things are just crucial. You don't really see like your opponent and other Republican opponents tackling this. They want to talk about like cultural issues that don't move the needle. So in closing, let's get some final remarks just kind of on all of it.
I think I think you've hit the nail on the head. We reached an inflection point. I mean, we're going to have to start making some decisions, and we're going to have to start making we are going to have to make some hard decisions about what this country stands for as we move forward. And to put it simply, I think in this race we've got a choice between somebody who has proven over the last 23 plus years, coming up on 24 years, that they are going to do whatever the party wants them to do, and they're not going to have the interest in the well-being of the people within their district. Like I said, I tell people that I've had more town hall meetings since the beginning of this campaign in the last 6 months than Mike Rogers has had in the last 9 years. I go out and every week I'm having conversations with people, just to find out what it is they're thinking and how we can serve them. And when we get elected, I mean, we are going to routinely have town hall meetings. So people, I had a black pastor ask me the other day, he said, why should a black voter trust a white politician in this state? And I said, I probably would tell you that you shouldn't. That being said, I will give you the opportunity repeatedly while I'm in Congress to tell me I'm doing a bad job. That's all I can promise you at this point. And he seemed fairly appreciative. We need to be elected officials should be held accountable, not by their party, but by the people that elected them. And we are running on a platform that says we have listened to the people, we are reacting to what they want, and we are doing what's best for the people of this district. Is everybody going to agree with us on what's best for the people of this district? No. Like I said, 35% of the people wouldn't vote for me under any circumstances. But then there's that large body of people that see what's going on. Now we just need to motivate them to get out to the polls.
Is there any hope that you and Mr. Rogers will engage in a public debate prior to Election Day?
We should have a press release coming out today. We sent him a certified letter that sat in his post office box for a week before he got picked up, asking him and people that I know that are experts in this, and there's a million experts in politics, but we offered, and we're using this in speeches. We have offered to agree to any nonpartisan organization to act as the sponsors, and we have agreed to hold it in any location in the 3rd District. When people look at me and they say, you're insane for agreeing to that up front, we want to debate him. Now, whether or not he will or not, we'll have to see. He doesn't seem to like talking to his constituents very much. I don't think he's necessarily going to be thrilled about talking to his opposition. But we are going to continue to offer to debate. We are going to make that part of our campaign so that everybody knows we're offering to debate. And I believe the free and open exchange of ideas is how we improve this country. And we are leaning forward into that.
I love it. All right, so Lee McInnis, District 3, Congress, fighting for families, workers, and veterans. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really great.
Lee McInnis, the number 4, Alabama.com is the website, and there's a ton of stuff there on me and my background. I write a ton of stuff to identify our positions on a whole variety of different issues. So there's a ton of stuff to read there about what we're fighting for in this campaign. So please, Lee McInnis, the number 4, Alabama.com.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lee, and good luck to you moving forward.
Jason, thanks. Hey, this is a great platform. I watch your content. I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Politics of fear and hate are wrong. We love you and politics of
But America,
love are right.
we are not going back.